Well, thank you all for joining us. I am Bob Allison. I am president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and the Colonial Society is a scholarly organization formed to study and perpetuate the study and interest in early American history. And 30 years ago, when we had our 100th anniversary, we asked Edmund Morgan to advise us on what the Colonial Society should do. And he said we should publish primary documents and encourage younger scholars. And we have been publishing primary documents for more than 100 years now. And all of our publications are available not only in book form, but also on our website, free of charge, fully searchable. And to encourage younger scholars, we began a graduate student forum, bringing some younger scholars to 87 Mount Vernon Street to tell us about their work. And I'm happy to see some of them here today, some of the alumni of the forum here today. And then the graduate forum committee thought another thing we could do is give advice on counsel on how to publish scholarly articles. And this session is really devoted to that. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Marla Miller, who has been chairing the Graduate Student Forum for the last few years. She is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Massachusetts. So thank you, Marla, for arranging this.
Hi, thank you, Bob. And is my audio all right? Everything's working okay? Good. Yes, as Bob mentioned, this notion for tonight's gathering came out of a cocktail party. Many fine ideas are born at a cocktail party. And so members of this committee and Holly were gathered at the headquarters on Mount Vernon Street at the June Forum last year. And we're thinking about ways that this committee could better support rising scholars and graduate students and help people connect to the Colonial Society and its membership. And so naturally, given Holly's role, conversation drifted to a focus on scholarly publishing and how do you really approach journal authorship for the first time when you're getting new scholarship ready for publication. How do you know when it's ready? How do you know how to go about choosing a journal, finding a home for your scholarship, and what does the process look like from there? So we're thrilled that Holly and Peter and Neal have joined us tonight, and my role is to introduce Holly, who will then introduce her co-panelists. So let me just share with you that Holly Jackson is the Bernard Balin editor of the New England Quarterly and an associate professor of English at UMass Boston, where she also serves as interim chair of the American Studies Department. A scholar of 19th century American cultural history, she's the author of 2 books, including American Radicals, How 19th Century Protests Shaped the Nation, which was named to the Smithsonian Magazine's list of the 10 best history books of 2019. She's also published a number of scholarly articles on 19th century US culture, as well as pieces in popular venues, including the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. So welcome, Holly, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Marla. I appreciate that. Hi, thank you so much for coming. I have been the editor of the New England Quarterly now for 12 days. So this is a relatively new position to me. I have been associate editor for some years now, and I'm really thrilled about the work we're going to do with the journal. And for you young historians, you're really crucial to that and to the journal's continuity and to its future. So I want to introduce my co-panelists, and then I will talk for a minute after that before I turn it over to them. So first, Peter Walker is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wyoming, specializing in the British Empire and the Atlantic world, with particular interests in religion, empire, and revolution. He's working on a book which asks how colonial Anglicans engaged with the religious modernity emerging in the age of revolutions. He's also editing with Dr. Christopher Minty a book-length documentary edition of the correspondence of the Loyalist refugee Miles Cooper. He's the winner of the 2016 Whitehill Prize in Early American Literature from the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, which we'll talk more about. His work has also been supported by the NEH, the Pritchard Prize from the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church, a Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship. Our other speaker is Neal Dugre, an associate professor of history at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. His research explores English colonialism in 17th century North America with a focus on Puritan endeavors in New England. This work has received financial support from institutions including the American Historical Association and Massachusetts Historical Society, and appeared in journals such as Connecticut History Review and the New England Quarterly. Indeed, in 2017, he received the Whitehill Prize in Early American History for his article on the origins of the United Colonies of New England. I asked Professor Walker and Professor Dugre to join us because they are both relatively recent winners of the Whitehill Prize, and they were both at the very beginning of their careers. Am I right in saying for both of you, this was your first publication? Yeah, so the Whitehill Prize, I will just tell you briefly, is one of the special aspects of the relationship between the Massachusetts Colonial Society and the New England Quarterly. So it's a very prestigious award in early American history. And for the purposes of the Whitehill Prize, early America is defined as the period to 1825. So not just colonial. People submit for this prize. We have the prize committee look at the submissions, but we also have many of them peer reviewed, and the winner of course gets a monetary award, and their article is published in the New England Quarterly under a very distinguished looking header announcing the prize, which I'll show you in a minute. But often other submissions that aren't awarded the Whitehill still end up in the journal, actually. So it's a good way for us to get really high quality submissions in colonial and early American, and I think it's a great thing for the author, and it's certainly a great thing for the journal. I want to note that we actually have a third winner of the Whitehill Prize with us tonight. Professor Marla Miller won the Whitehill Prize in 1997. Marla, I think you were only the second woman to win it, actually. Brava. Wow. So we'll want her to add to what Peter and Neal have to say about how she did it and what it's meant to her career. So I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about the journal, its history and editorial focus, a little bit about my own experience of publishing and what I look for in submissions as an editor, and just some general advice for writers. So the New England Quarterly, as you may know, is an interdisciplinary journal founded 96 years ago by Samuel Eliot Morison, Arthur M. Schlesinger, and other Harvard historians of that generation. It was later led by Perry Miller, Edmund Morgan, Oscar Hanlon, Bernard Balin, and scholars of comparable significance also in literary studies as well. So the journal has published over the years some of the most canonical scholarly work on traditional historical subjects like maritime history, political history, religious history, the Puritans, the Mathers, the Adamses, and so on. And, you know, obviously we're very proud of that legacy, and I want to make sure that we're still the journal that people think of for the best work produced now on all of those topics. But those founding editors also noted in 1928 that, quote, each generation must rewrite history from its own point of view. And I want the NEQ to remain a venue as well for that rewriting, for that point of view that will come from your generation of American historians. So to that end, I hope to generate, continued interest in submissions in all of those areas, but I would love to see more submissions on Native and Indigenous New England, environmental studies, slavery in New England, early American gender and sexuality, new approaches to archival studies, and so on. We will, of course, retain our regional focus, but we're always interested in essays that can frame those local studies transnationally, hemispherically, diasporically, globally. So I will just mention that my first interaction with the journal was also as a graduate student myself. I published an article that came out in 2009. I'm a 19th centuryist, as I mentioned, so I knew the journal as a place with strengths in the Transcendentalists and Nathaniel Hawthorne and William Lloyd Garrison. These are all areas that I have worked in. I chose the New England Quarterly because I was writing something about a writer named Sarah Orne Jewett, and she is a sort of the most prominent figure in a literary movement of the late 19th century called called local color fiction or New England regionalism. So the New England Quarterly has been a place where, I mean, people have been publishing on this book in the New England Quarterly since the 40s. I knew that there was sort of a tradition of publishing there, which I think is a good way to think about where to place an article and who might be interested. And it was an interdisciplinary piece, had to do with a kind of a theory that white New Englanders were not reproducing enough and the birth rate was falling off, et cetera. People have always been pretty concerned about that. And so it had to do with economics, it had to do with demographics, it certainly had to do with literature, but it also had a kind of an edgy, like race studies, sort of like informed by queer theory leaning to it. And the journal went for it. And I was really pleased to be able to sort of add what I felt was a new contribution to that tradition. My editor at that time was Lynn Rhodes. And I will say that she was the most aggressive style editor that I have ever had in an academic context. I've actually never had an academic editor come after my sentences in the way that Lynn Rhodes did. And only with trade editors, like with newspapers and with Penguin Random House, have I had that level of editing. And at the time, you know, I was 29 and like knew absolutely everything about it and was could not believe it, right? But now I think, I love that level of attention actually. And so I'm going to use her as a model and sort of feel free to do that kind of editing on my own, I think. So my advice about publishing, we talked about kind of how do you know when it's ready, what is a scholarly essay? I would say for starters that it's something much more developed than a seminar paper and much more distilled than a dissertation chapter, meaning that it is something more condensed than that, and more cooked than a seminar paper. I would say it takes a year or more of work to write a submittable essay. I think of a good submission as something that is both clearly new, something that is a new contribution, a new direction, but it also just as clearly has to be engaged with what has already been said, what is already known. A big point that we'll probably talk about tonight is the idea of stakes in a piece of analytical writing, the idea of a contribution, what light your piece sheds on a really small subject, of course, but why that matters in its largest implications. And generally really good articles are kind of layered in that way, where it's an elevator that can stop at every floor. There might be very small points and broad implications as well. I want to suggest that you should have readers, not just your advisor, but other readers who can help you with your writing and with your ideas. And I'm hoping that our panelists and maybe some of my faculty colleagues here could say something about how those kinds of relationships are formed. But I have to say that the grad forum, the CSM grad forum, is about the most effective way to do that I can really imagine. And I think you should read a few issues of the journal. As I mentioned, I was familiar with the New England Quarterly. I knew what they published and what their style was, what their tone was. And I think it helps. Like I think when I get submissions that are like completely outside of kind of what we do, it's immediately obvious. And so I think when you're choosing between, a handful of journals, you can kind of craft your CV in that way about like which article kind of belongs where. The submission and review process, I'll just explain briefly. You email your submission to us, neq@umb.edu. The grad assistants sort of receive it and file it and put it in a system. It goes first to me or to one of the associate editors, and we do a first reading and decide at that point whether to send it to peer reviewers. If it goes to peer reviewers, then we ask that they take 6 weeks. They come back with a recommendation of either revise with some final revisions, or of revise and resubmit, or of decline to publish. So they write reports, they send them back to me, and I get in touch with the author. And after that point, there's generally a round of revision, and then ideally we're off to the races. And so one thing that I would really like to prioritize going forward is a swift review process and a quick turnaround for writers in the academy. That's hard to come by, and I think that's something we can do at the New England Quarterly, and that we ought to do it. I think especially for young scholars, that's very important. What else? I wanted to address that hurdle of that sort of first pass that we give it, and how I decide about a desk rejection versus if I'm going to send it to peer reviewers. And I mean, from my perspective, what I'm deciding is whether the essay is in a kind of condition where after one really rigorous revision, would I want to see it in the journal, right, with my name on the masthead, one. But two, for peer reviewers, I'm asking two colleagues to take the time to do it. And so as long as I feel like, yes, I feel like I really want this work to get out there, and I do want to ask my colleagues to take a look at that, then that's a good, case to have it peer reviewed. But one thing I'll say is that I am not, as I said, I'm a 19th centuryist, so I'm not, for instance, an expert on colonial Anglicanism. And so, I get a lot of essays that I don't have expertise in, just as my predecessor, Jonathan Chu, was a revolutionary historian, got submissions on Nathaniel Hawthorne that he was not an expert in. But the thing is that we don't have to be, because that's what the peer reviewers are for. But I wanted to sort of examine what I think makes it clear to any reader that you have a good, viable, peer reviewable essay. And I think there's a couple of points to hit, and because this needs to be accomplished, my advice to you is that this needs to be accomplished in the first 2 or 3 pages of your submission. I think that this is just like a kind of a good thing to strive for. I mean, I'm looking for, in general, a kind of evidence of engagement with with the historiography. So there's a kind of a density to essays that are going to make it that I can see. But if we just focus on the opening 3 pages of an article, the things I would draw your attention to are the opener, by which I mean literally the first sentence. Within those first 2 or 3 pages, I should have an opener that's good. You're establishing the topic, you're establishing the stakes, you're establishing the intervention, the argument, and then ideally you're establishing the organization. I have our 3 Whitehill award-winning essays pulled up because I want to show you how quickly and elegantly all of those things that I just named can be done, and basically have to be done. So I just want to pull these up. To me, all 3 of them are from their very opening, really energetically engaged in telling me why to keep reading. They're dramatizing the stakes. They're saying why this article matters for the field, what larger conversations it's part of outside the particular figure or event they address. So let's look at these, and then I'll turn it over to Peter and Neal. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Are you seeing this? Yeah, okay. So let's take a look here. So this is what it looks like when you win the Whitehill Prize and they publish your essay in the New England Quarterly. It's really fancy. It's a huge honor. And this appears over your essay. I would just draw your attention in all of these essays to this note that will appear that demonstrates what I was talking about earlier, which is that all of these authors have a lot of readers. Now, of course, this note is not included in submissions, so it's not something that I know going in if you've had, a lot of people look at it. But you will find that these really successful essays were produced kind of by a community of scholars, which again, I think as a graduate student, that's really hard to find, and that the grad forum can really be that for you. And that's one of the I think that's a really big selling point for it. Looking at Neal's essay, I just noticed a few things. To me, the writing in all of these essays is just really snappy. It's just not flat at all, and it's just pulling me into it. So in the first sentence here, a mystical preacher who founded the plantation of Shawmut on Narragansett Bay. I'm like, okay, mystical preacher. Already I'm a little bit drawn in by this opener. Peculiar theology, a knack for destabilizing civil order. This first paragraph, what it's doing is outlining a topic in a way that is, to me, the language just feels alive enough where for a first paragraph, right, outlining the topic. But look how quickly we move from there to the historiography. So We already are we're only in the second paragraph of the essay here. Historians studying those processes typically adhere to a paradigm, et cetera. In other words, like, I'm already understanding that this person knows they are making an intervention and is kind of strenuously, like, is as quickly as possible pointing out that intervention, is referencing what previous historians have said. We're still in the second paragraph of the essay here. This perspective assumes, et cetera, starting to sort of like break this down. You see what I mean, how quickly we're moving here. All three of the essays that I'm going to show you also use sections. And so by this section break that's coming right here, we're still, I bet this is 3 pages in Microsoft Word, maybe 4 into the document. We have had that opener, the contribution, the stakes, the intervention, and a statement of a thesis here. And then we're seeing that we're not going to get an undifferentiated 30 pages of text, but rather it's going to be organized, and he has set that out for us. Similarly, in Peter's article, I would point out, what we have here is something almost like an anecdotal opener, which I myself love an anecdotal opener, by which I mean it starts with a little story, starts with a narrative feeling. I have an article coming out in the next Massachusetts Historical Review, and the title is very shocking. It's called, I think it's called Abolitionist Sex Radicalism, Free Love, and Garrisonian Thought and Activism. But it starts with the description of a clam bake. And that's an anecdotal opener. Like, you're starting with a kind of an interesting story from the record that people don't know. And here we have a kind of narrative language. I noticed when I was looking at Peter's article, we have some scene setting as the 7 Years' War drew to a close. The Archbishop of Canterbury set in motion a plan to appoint a bishop. Word of this adds to a controversy already underway. The ensuing pamphlet continued to rage on both sides before petering out at the end of the decade. This to me is narrative language that again is alive and is kind of not flat and ponderous. And then again, look how quickly he moves to the historiography. This is the second paragraph of the essay. The prospect of an American bishop has had a similar effect on historians. He's gone from the thing itself to what we already know about it. Continues in the third paragraph, scholarship on the controversy has been preoccupied with debating whether it constituted, et cetera. In other words, like, we're already in the scholarly debate there. So again, this is just accomplished really, really quickly. And I think that's impressive. Similarly with Marla, she opens with a quote, which I think is another great gambit. She's going to tell us about the journals of Rebecca Dickinson and starts with a quote from those journals. And one thing that I thought was very strategic about this, I have to say, is that looking at this piece, I felt that by a couple of pages into this, I felt that she was engaging in a sly way with the idea that the subject might be rejected as boring. So look at this. We're probably 2 pages in on Microsoft Word. In 1892, when Hatfield historian Margaret Miller, and the resonance is here between this author and this journal, and then going back to 1892, it's unmistakable, submitted excerpts from the newly discovered manuscript to the New England Magazine, editors rejected Dickinson's text as too dolefully dulcet, too awfully theological and metaphysical for their pages. That's because she knows that I might think that, or we might think that, right? But then she says, in fact, she says, its spiritual reflections will, I hope, attract the attention of historians' religion. It has much to contribute to an appreciation of late 18th century New England Calvinism as it was understood. It also yields scattered glimpses into everyday life in early Massachusetts. And then it also offers, there's one other thing it offers, and she still hasn't gotten to her main point. But then catch this. It is precisely the dolefully dulcet, the ceaselessly searching, the sorrowful quality of this text that interests me. At first meeting, Rebecca Dickinson is a sour companion. We're still on page 2 here. And I'm like, this is just, to me, this is creating a lot of tension. She's saying, I know you think colonial women are boring and sour and dour, and this woman was never married, and that maybe you have feelings about that. But that's exactly what's going to be interesting, and just stick with me because I know what I'm doing and I'm going to show you, right? And I feel that right away. And so I think these are really good examples of what an excellent article can do in just mere paragraphs. And so with that, I of course am here to take all of your questions, and I just want to turn it over. I'll turn it over to Peter and then to Neal.
Okay, thank you, Holly. I've never had anyone kind of go through my article like that in front of me. That was quite interesting. Thank you very much for asking me to talk. It was really important to me winning that prize a few years ago, so I'm really pleased to be here and to be part of this. So please, if you've got any questions when I'm talking, just interrupt me or put them in the chat and I'll notice them. I thought the most sort of useful thing for the grad students would just be to describe what I did and for better or for worse, like how I went through this. And then you can sort of decide how much of this you can apply to your own situations or not. But I just a little, well, two things I thought I could talk about. Firstly, the question of how do you kind of take a article out of a dissertation, because a dissertation is a sort of a big argument. And I had 6 dissertation chapters, and so each of those is kind of 1/6 of an argument. But article can't be 1/6 of an argument. It has to be kind of its own thing. No one's going to read an article where you say, oh, you have to read the rest of the dissertation to have this make sense. So how I thought about that intellectually, how do you make an article kind of stand on its own when you're also thinking about this larger thing as well? And the other thing I thought I could talk a little bit about was the kind of process of publishing this Whitehill essay is quite different from the normal process of publishing like a regular article. And I think it was actually a really good thing for me, kind of at the stage I was at, including in some ways I wasn't really aware of at the time. Maybe I could start with that, because that segues on quite well from what Holly was telling us about how the journal works. So I got this 2016. So if anything's changed in the meantime, Holly, maybe you could sort of update us. But the way this prize works is they collect submissions where people send in submissions to the prize, and then the winner is chosen by the 3 judges kind of from those submissions. And that's different from sort of other article prizes maybe go to an article that's already been accepted in the journal. So the best essay in this journal this year gets the prize. So to get that, you have to kind of go through 2 steps. You have to go through the first step of getting accepted into the journal and the sort of normal process of peer review, and then you have to be kind of chosen at the kind of second stage as the prize winner. So the Whitehill Prize is different. You just kind of go straight for the prize, and then I guess maybe submitting to the journal as a backup if the judges don't choose that particular essay. And so one of the things that meant that I almost sort of bypassed the whole process of peer review. The judges had some kind of comments on the essay, but it didn't go through a sort of whole process of going backwards and forwards with anonymous reviewers. So it came out very, very quickly as well. So I submitted it in the end of the year, December 2016, and then it was accepted in March. And at that point, I could put it on my CV. And by September the next year, it was out in print. And I don't think you could get an article out quite that quickly any other way. And at the same time, I was trying to publish this other thing in an edited volume, and it just dragged on and on and on and on for years. And so the contrast was really, really, really striking. So one thing about this Whitehill Prize is if you're wanting something kind of on your CV right now, it turned out to be quite a good way of doing that. That's not why I applied. I wasn't thinking of that at the time, but in hindsight. The thing that caught my eye about, so I finished the dissertation in 2016. I defended over the summer, and then I sort of had one dissertation chapter that I knew could be the basis of an article, and I hadn't published anything from that dissertation project, and I wanted to publish something, and I wanted to kind of publish it quickly for job market reasons, and I sort of had this one in mind, and so I did the work of revising it then over the fall of 2016, right after I finished, right after I defended. The reason I kind of chose the New England Quarterly and to go for this title was just because the email arrived in my inbox from HNet. I'm afraid I wasn't any more sort of wise and systematic. It was just a little bit down to kind of chance and contingency. But the three judges were Mary Beth Norton and Frederick Anderson and David Hall, and Anderson, of course, works on the 7 Years' War, and David Hall on religion in New England, and Mary Beth Norton, among other things, on loyalism. And this essay was about sort of religion and loyalism in New England at the end of the 7 Years' War, and it was just kind of perfectly. I couldn't really have asked for a better choice of three judges. I don't think they just choose things that they're interested in. There's got a very wide range of topics that these things go to, but that was what caught my eye about it. And then the other thing was actually just the prize money, $2,500, and obviously the getting the money is nice, but also I was very aware that it was a sort of measure of prestige that was quite legible to a lot of people, right? So having a prize-winning article just kind of stands out like a little bit more than an article. Holly showed us the very fancy header, and the prize money is part of that. So I always say, it's a $2,500 prize, and I think that's quite important because that's something that people understand, even if they're not in your subfield or your field. So you could be an administrator, a dean, you'd be like an astronomer or whatever. You don't know that the William and Mary Quarterly is a prestigious journal because there's nothing in the name that tells you that, but you do know that $2,500 is a lot of money for a prize. And so I think it's something that translates, it's legible to a lot of people. Just seeing the question in the chat here, yes, exactly. I wanted to advertise the dissertation. I hadn't published anything from it, so it was partly a way of saying, like letting people know what I worked on. It was partly about the CV. You don't want to publish too much of a dissertation because then the editor will, if you try to get it published in as a book, the editor will be kind of worried about, oh, it's all been published somewhere else already. But the editor I've spoken to about now hopefully publishing this as a book wasn't concerned about having one chapter that was published. So I think it's a way of kind of advertising just by taking a little part of it, but not taking the whole thing off into articles. How long have I been talking for? I've got a few minutes left, I think. Well, the other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was how I knew that dissertation chapter was a good one to publish as an article. So the article is not just the dissertation chapter, kind of word for word, but it's based on one particular chapter, and most of the research is the same, although there's also some extra research in there that actually wouldn't have worked very well in the dissertation. But the dissertation chapter is kind of part of this large dissertation argument about the status and the role of Anglicans in the British Empire. But I had this one chapter where it was also making an argument about the impact of the 7 Years' War on the British Empire, and without going into too much detail, the sort of efforts to incorporate Catholics into the British Empire and all the sort of aftershocks, the problems that come with that, and the sort of different tensions that get inflamed and different people get upset in different ways. And that argument actually didn't fit very well in the dissertation, and I couldn't make it at length in the dissertation because the committee would have said this doesn't kind of belong here. This is a distraction from what you're doing elsewhere in the dissertation. So it sort of was a natural one to sort of take out of the context of the other dissertation chapters and to make that argument at kind of more length and not having to worry about it not fitting in with the rest of it. Maybe I can sort of leave it for now and let Neal talk as well, and then I can answer your questions. That's what I had to start with.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here. And I thought I would talk a little bit about my first article and along the way share a few general thoughts about kind of writing and publishing. I published with the Quarterly this article in 2018, and it had won the 2017 Whitehill Prize. And that article, like a lot of my work, was a long time coming. In fact, as I was getting ready for this forum, I realized that I presented the very first iteration of that research at the Colonial Society's Graduate Forum, I think in 2010. So it felt kind of fitting that I was going to talk to you all about it today, about kind of the path it took after that moment. The article grew out of the first chapter of my dissertation. My first attempt of several, you will see, to get it published came immediately after I had finished writing the chapter. Do not do this. I would not recommend that you do this. But I was trying to force myself to get more comfortable with sharing my work. So on a lark, I saw the HNet announcement and decided that I was going to submit it for the Whitehill Prize competition. And I figured that I had nothing to lose. I had a colleague in grad school who had won the Whitehill Prize. And so I thought, well, why not? Why not me? Why not this chapter? And as odd as it seems to me now, submitting it for the competition somehow felt a little bit less intimidating than submitting it directly to a journal, something I had never done before. And so a few months later, the editor of the Quarterly emailed me to inform me that, in fact, it had not been selected for the prize, little surprise to me, but that they would like to consider it for publication in the journal. And they wanted my permission to send it out for review, which felt to me like a fantastic outcome. It felt like things were in motion, kind of getting me involved in publishing my work. And then the reader reports came back. And the editor very kindly informed me that based on those reports, they were rejecting the article. And I'll never forget the email because the editor recognized that I was this young grad student, and I was, and they worked really hard to let me down easy. They gave me some general feedback and advice, included a couple quotations from one of the reader reports, and then told me that they weren't going to include the full reader reports because the feedback was so scathing that they thought it would be more harmful than helpful. So I was grateful for that mercy, right? And also really actually grateful for the recognition that another expert in the field, an accomplished scholar, had looked at my essay and had looked at this reader report and judged that report to be excessively critical. But it was still a pretty demoralizing experience for reasons that I'm sure are very familiar to all of you, right? As a PhD student, you're working on this dissertation, you're trying to find a space for yourself in the field, and that's a quest that requires a lot of vulnerability. It comes with some pretty high stakes, particularly if you're interested in a career in academia. So to learn that an expert in the field thinks that this piece that you have poured your heart and soul into is complete garbage, it's pretty hard to hear, right? I think today I would advise myself or someone else in a similar situation to kind of dust yourself off and just send it out to a different journal. But that wasn't the headspace that I was in at the time. So I just moved on and I focused on kind of writing up the remaining chapters of the dissertation. But as time went by and I was becoming more and more immersed in the project, and I started to think about kind of the evidence that I was using, the arguments that I was making in the larger project, and I recognized that I really wanted to publish this particular material in an article and have it kind of be that sort of advertisement about the larger project. And this was for a couple of different reasons. I was thinking at the time about relationship between articles and a book project. And I wanted to use the material in what was then a chapter, right, to think through some broader conceptual issues that I thought were going to be pretty essential to the bigger book project. So in other words, I had an objective in mind, and I was imagining this article as serving a purpose that went beyond just trying to kind of get a line on my CV to get a publication out, right? I saw this article as being kind of related to, but also separate from this larger book project. And I had it in my head that there's a good article in there somewhere, and that I had something of value to say. And I was also determined that the New England Quarterly was going to be the best fit for this article. And you've heard it already. I think fit is very important in getting an article placed. And that was for a variety of different reasons. But I had it in my mind that this was the right place for the article. So I worked on revising this chapter into an article, and I turned it in, and I got a desk rejection because it was too long, and devastated again, right? But more resilient this time because the feedback was more positive. Length is something I can fix, right? And there are some other smaller issues that I felt like I could grapple with pretty easily. And so I used a conference workshop as kind of a place for me to go and do some of that work and get feedback from other people. And then I was determined to resubmit it. And I decided that since the article I was writing, which was fundamentally different than anything I had done before, was well suited for the Whitehill Prize competition, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic, right? If I not only got a published article out of this, but also one that won a prize too. And I'll be honest that plan was also strategic because the Whitehill Prize competition came with a hard deadline. And I really needed that at that moment in my career. Whereas submitting an article to a journal, right, doesn't have that same sort of urgency. So I used that deadline to force myself to have an endpoint for these revisions and to send the article out again. And I decided that when perhaps inevitably I learned that had not been selected, I could just turn it right around and then formally submit it to the quarterly or to a different journal. And again, I had this idea in my head that this was the place that this article, this piece needed to be, that it really belonged. And I mean that in a really kind of a literal sense. In a moment of procrastination, this might sound a little strange, I wrote up the title page for this essay as if it were completed and published in the New England Quarterly. And I printed that out and I put it on my wall, right? As I guess a sort of vision board about kind of the outcome I was working towards. And I think that we're all different and we need different things as writers and scholars and people. But for myself, this was a small but actually really powerful way of kind of pushing back against some of the critical narrative that I constructed in my mind, especially about this particular piece, okay? And so this time around, the outcome was much better. The essay won the prize, and then I got to work with the editors at the Quarterly to make some small changes and to see the article in print pretty quickly. I learned a lot along the way, beyond just resiliency, right? I'll briefly mention, I think, two things. First, I learned something we've already touched on already today, and that was to appreciate a journal article as being a fundamentally different form of writing than, for instance, a dissertation chapter. I'm sure this sounds obvious enough, but I found that it was really helpful for me to study how a successful journal article, so that is an article that was published, in your target journal, is actually constructed. And I did that by working with a model. You've read hundreds of journal articles, right? And you know how they're organized and fundamentally structured. But for me, I found that it was extraordinarily useful to narrow the scope of possibilities of what form my article could take by using a model in a really explicit kind of way. So I identified an article in my field that I really admired and was published in a very prestigious journal. And I spent a good deal of time outlining precisely how the author structured the article and their argument and analyzing not so much the content of the essay, but the work that each sentence in that essay did, right, beyond the specific content. And I did that at a really granular level. And I found that exercise to be very valuable because it gave me measurable targets, right, that went beyond just word counts, right? It gave me a detailed roadmap of how I could move from the ideas that were in my head, the notes I had about my research, the early drafts that this essay had taken, how I could get from all of that to a compelling article. I had a sense of how to break the essay up into different sections. I had a sense of how many paragraphs I wanted in each section and what I needed each of those paragraphs to do. And so I had this model for myself, instructions really, of precisely what to do in each sentence and paragraph of the text. Now, of course, the end product doesn't look like, sort of the model that you originally worked from, but it gave me a sense of demystifying kind of how an article comes into formation, right? And what the different elements of it are. And the last thing I'll say, and I can turn it back to Holly, is that I learned to trust myself and my process a bit more. I'm the kind of writer that gets in their own way a lot. So I've learned that I need to be really conscious of that in a non-judgmental way and really be vigilant in differentiating between roadblocks that are real, right? Usually imposed externally, the things that I need to actually do to get a piece accepted for publication, and then roadblocks that are of my own creation and usually can be ignored. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much to you both. That was really helpful. Marla, did you want to say something about your Whitehill award-winning essay?
Yeah, I won't say much, but before I do, I want to second Neal's point about studying the structure. I used to do an exercise with students in my first probably 10 years of teaching, where we took this basket we took about 6 journal articles, and 1 week we only looked at the introductions and we tried to suss out how does it work. Then we only looked at the conclusion. We only looked at the outline. And you can learn a lot about how a journal article works by doing that. And so, I just want to strongly second that, especially if you have a target journal in mind, because as Holly said at the outset, you really want to conform to the tone and style of the journal, so that kind of work really pays off. So I wanted to second that. And the other thing I wanted to add is just that it's interesting to hear you all talk about choosing a chapter from the dissertation and how the article relates to a dissertation. I hadn't really thought about this before just now, but the My Part Alone article was my master's thesis. So I sort of knew as I went from the master's thesis to the dissertation that while Rebecca Dickinson would play a role in the dissertation, that was going to be about her work as an artisan. And I wasn't going to be pursuing this thinking about singlehood anymore. So it was sort of an opportunity to say, well, that's that, to take what I learned about her life alone from the master's thesis and publish it before I moved on to something else. So just if folks are in that situation where you have a master's thesis that you put a lot of work into, that was probably a 100 and some page master's thesis at UNC that I found sort of the best of and wrestled that into the article that won the prize. So just throwing that out as another opportunity for publishing. If you have work that you're going to set aside, a way to bring that to fruition before you move on. And I just can't help but add that Lynn Rhodes was a miracle to me at the time because I was very inexperienced, and having that sort of intellectual camaraderie with your editor is a wonderful thing. She asked a lot of smart questions that had never crossed my mind that I then had to either defend what I had said or dig up some new evidence or respond to in some way. And so you can expect, that you might be in that kind of a conversation too, which is just really, really fruitful and productive. So I will leave it at that.
And I'll just say that these, we're hearing about these winners of the Whitehill Prize that are so early, but that this is also, I mean, one of our recent winners is Cornelia Dayton, who is a very distinguished full professor at UConn. So I mean, even maybe more so for us to just to think about yourself as a, writing a master's thesis or a dissertation chapter, and that's the company you're keeping. Can I answer any questions about early article submissions, and if you've never published a journal article before, any questions about what you should be thinking about?
May I just make a comment? Having edited the journal for almost 20 years, but the point is, the comments about Lynn Rhodes, absolutely essential. I want to point out that we've used the term article, and that's fine. But Lynn always looked at things, and I did as well, as essays. They're essays, and the essay has a structure to it. And the construction was absolutely important. It was absolutely vital. We would more than occasion get chapters from a dissertation. They were always identifiable. You always knew when that chapter from a dissertation, and it didn't work. So I really would like to emphasize, when you're writing, think about the journal, read what's been in the journal before, but think about the construction of your essay. And I think that's vitally important.
Yes, and not all, I mean, one of the amazing things about the New England Quarterly is we really do have a pretty broad readership, in the sense that it's not only academic specialists. It's a scholarly journal, but it is not only, our subscribers are not only academic historians or academic literary critics. And it's not to say that it is that the style is in any way colloquial or loosey-goosey. I mean, these are people who really expect scholarly precision. But I think that there is also an expectation for readability, and that you ought to be able to sort of look at the articles that are not in your particular specialty and learn something and enjoy them. And that's, I think that was a guiding thing for Lynn, is, no kind of obscure academic ease. I mean, clarity was really a value, and I think that's really important. Oh, the bullets that I said that I think ideally should be really energetically attacked in the first section, the first 3-4 pages. I believe I said opener, topic, which is different than the argument. Opener, topic, stakes, intervention, historiography, thesis. And then, you sometimes can gesture toward a kind of what people call a roadmap, which is to say what you're going to cover and how the argument will proceed.
The other thing I just wanted to add on to that very, very quickly, and I also, like Neal, found it very useful to outline other articles and to see what they did, but especially sort of finding an article that I wasn't interested in, that I didn't know anything about. It was just completely new to me. If I was doing it with something where I cared about the content, I would just be reading for the content, but just taking something that was completely alien to me, then it was much easier to be really technical about it and just to do the outlining. So I found that very helpful.
There's a question here about how we avoid, or I think about sort of the choice of peer reviewers. I will say that if, when your essay has a bone to pick with some other scholar, we do not send your essay to that scholar. So, I mean, no one who is too hot, like meaning somebody who is like a heavy interlocutor of the piece, your dissertation advisor, your colleague, at your same institution, none of these people will be your peer reviewers. And in terms of if someone else has been a reader for you, that is something that the peer reviewers always tell us. It's just kind of a matter of professional etiquette and ethics, I think. But we often hear back from peer reviewers, I've actually already seen this essay, or I've seen a previous draft of this essay. Blake?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. This is really helpful. I guess I have 2 questions. The first is more of a practical question about evidence. I've got a piece that I think might be ready, but thanks in part to COVID shutdowns and when I started my program, it doesn't have manuscript sources from archives. So I wondered if anyone who's had that experience publishing thinks it might be worth for me to spend a couple weeks and trying to dig some stuff out just to prove my bona fides in terms of the evidence section and gather some archival sources. And my second question is about sort of self-conscious about the fact that I think I've got a decent piece, but I'm struggling to come up with the so what of the article is. It feels like it should be the first thing I have figured out, yet I'm still trying to navigate exactly what I believe the overall contribution is, or why the stakes of it matter. So I was curious if anyone had struggled with that problem as they were going in the direction of publishing, thinking about again how they can frame you do all this research, you write what you think is a good essay, and then trying to come up with the so what question or the stakes around it. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really great questions. I'm gonna let a historian answer the question about archival sources and about whether that would be a deal breaker for you as a peer reviewer. I will answer the question about stakes. Another term that people use to talk about stakes in an academic article or essay or piece of analytical writing is the term motive. Like, what is your motive for wanting to write this? And some examples of motives. I mean, maybe you're overthinking it, or you're not seeing the stakes of it, because I mean, an example of a motive can be the kind of, for instance, like a classic academic setup is something like, you know, an argument that could be boiled down to like seems to be X, but is really Y. Or, you know, you could think of it in terms of like, people have thought X, but closer examination reveals Y. Or this seemingly small, you know, like Professor Miller's article, you know, she's sort of saying, here's this woman, right, who lived and died in colonial New England. Here's her journal. She's interesting to me, but I think she should be interesting to you, and here's why. That's what the stakes are, is basically like, can she make a persuasive case that there is some reason for me to care, and that there's something to be learned there, meaning it is shedding light on larger formations, and it has a larger context that's going to be intellectually fruitful for a lot of readers, not just people interested in this one woman. I think that's stakes, you know.
Can I comment on the archival business? It is likely, hopefully, that your essay will go to readers who know the topic, 1 or 2 readers, wherever it happens to be. What you really, as an author, what you really don't want to happen is to have one of those readers say, why didn't you look at X, Y, or Z? I think that is a very embarrassing, all kinds of criticisms one can make of an essay, but perhaps the most telling one is that he or she did not look at an important archival source. So I would recommend delaying a bit and digging out those archives.
Holly, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just answering this question in the chat about next steps, maybe before you email us a submission, would just be have people read it, you know, make sure that you have taken some time and that it is at a proper stage of kind of revision, you return to it. Someone has advised you that they think it's ready, and then, yeah, you just email us. Yes, so we do have these other, there's a question in the chat about about edited documents. You know, we don't do the kind of major additions, right, that the Colonial Society does, but we do shorter pieces. Yes, there is a kind of a memoranda and documents feature that we do in the New England Quarterly for shorter pieces, like, you know, could be some lost fragments of Margaret Fuller's diary that no one's seen before, or a short story, or a set of poems, or whatever it is. And in that case, generally there is a kind of header essay. And while I haven't been, it hasn't fallen to me yet to be in charge of that solely, but I would say that it still gets some kind of, it still has to be sent to peer reviewers in some way, but it's kind of up to this, you know, the submitter will kind of give us a proper context and a little introduction for the memorandum. And yes, we're still interested in pieces like that.
Holly, I wonder if you could say a little more. You mentioned in the beginning about the importance of circulating drafts and work in progress beyond your faculty. And I wonder if you would like to say a little bit more about that, or our co-panelists or members of the committee. How do you approach or cultivate those relationships with people not on your faculty to get to the point where they might read and comment on article length work?
Yeah, I wonder for Peter and Neal, because you both cite quite a few readers, and you were really at the very beginning of your careers.
I think conferences are really important in that sense. And specifically, I looked for conferences that allowed for engagement beyond the presentation of a 10-minute paper or something like that. So like workshop opportunities. And so actually I met Peter at one of a conference that has a workshop like that. And I used that for kind of the final edits on the article that we've been talking about. And I think that's extraordinarily helpful because it was people who were not necessarily personally invested in me, but they have some expertise in early America in general. And so they were able to look at my work in a way that was a bit more separated from kind of the very specialized nature of the content of the article. And also walk me through kind of certain elements of their perspective on how to deal with actually some of the feedback I had received from the editor at the time. So I think if you can find opportunities like that, workshop opportunities, that can be really helpful as a way to get a sounding board for whatever piece that you're working on.
I thought the other thing I'd say to that, I think conferences and workshops are definitely the best thing that you can do. I'm also absolutely terrible about sort of networking at conferences and socializing at conferences. It doesn't come very naturally to me. I always had more success emailing people. I mean, I got to know some people through conferences as well. But some of the relationships I've built have just started with me emailing someone saying like, I read your work, I really like it. I work on something similar, and then kind of have, with a question or something, and then to just start talking over email. So if you're not someone who sort of naturally flourishes at like a cocktail hour at a conference or something like that, then I think people, I would be delighted to sort of get an email from someone saying that I'd read my work and that they were interested in it. Like most people feel that way, and so I don't think you should be sort of reluctant or sort of nervous to just kind of reach out of the blue over email. It's always worked quite well for me. So.
Does anyone want to speak to this question of if you get a rejection, how you know whether you should continue with it? I mean, my tendency would be to say, yes, of course you have to try again. I mean, that's, rejections are inevitable. I think it's, especially if it's something that is as something like a piece of your dissertation, where you know that this is intellectually what you want to put out there, and that you have put the required amount of work into it, then yes, there are issues of fit, right, where it may not be right for one journal, but that it doesn't mean that it won't find a place somewhere else. And so, yeah, my tendency would be to say, to try it again. And I don't know if you mean a kind of a revise and resubmit situation, in which case I would say you absolutely should stick with it, or just an actual rejection. Then I would say, yes, I think you take the readers' reports and you, let yourself be indignant about them for one afternoon. And then the next day, you actually realize that the people are unfortunately really smart and really helped you and were right about a lot of things, and you rewrite it and you send it to another journal.
I think it also, you learn about kind of where you are in your professional career, right? And so like, I went through a litany of rejections and when I was talking, but I knew, like Holly was saying, this is my dissertation, and I knew I had other really smart people who were saying, like, you're doing good work here, right? So I knew there was something there, and I felt convicted about the project in that sense. But I also knew that I was doing this for the first time, and yeah, I was going to get rejections. And so that part of kind of emerging as a professional in the field was learning how to deal with that and kind of bounce back a little bit. So I think particularly early on, I wouldn't be too discouraged, if possible, by those rejections. The thing I will say related to that I found out kind of the more you write and are involved in publishing is that overwhelmingly, I've been amazed at the generosity of other scholars, editors, journal editors, and the readers, who really do help you to understand your own work in new and important ways. And so I think you're going to run into instances where you get really critical feedback from one or more of the readers. But I think when you look at most of that feedback very carefully, you'll see that it is designed really carefully to help you kind of advance and turn what you have into something much stronger. I think people in the field are really kind in that way.
Over the course of my career, I've had far more rejections than acceptances, far more. So my advice is readers are not infallible. Editors are not infallible. I have often seen essays that we rejected at the New England Quarterly over the course of years shows up in other journals. And the reverse is also true. The other journals have rejected articles that we have then published. So my suggestion, if you have a rejection, take the editor's criticism seriously. You need to do that, but you don't necessarily have to take all of the criticisms. If it is a revise and resubmit, I'd be very careful about that. You could be simply wasting your time. Think about that carefully, because journals really move on. Once editors have rejected an essay, they're really quickly moving on to other essays, so that be careful about that. But I would continue to push forward and try other journals.
It's something we all share, I mean, you're no doubt on Twitter and hear the jokes about Reader 2 and like what a jerk Reader 2 is. And like, that's just something we share, it's just like a common experience. And it's just part of academic culture, for better or for worse. JP.
And some reviewer twos are lovely as well. Like peer reviewers, you get the occasional difficult character, but the point of it is it's like collaborative. It's a chance to make the article better by having like other people collaborate and to share their feedback. Almost my only, in a way, my only small regret with the Whitehill cycle, I sort of bypassed that. Is I do wonder, like, maybe if we've gone through more of a peer review, maybe it would have been a better article at the end of it. So there are like some difficult characters out there, but I don't think it's. I think we should think about the kind of the positives as well.
We have a hand up. Yep.
Yeah, hi. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for your time and your wisdom. This is extremely helpful and generative. This is just a quick follow-up to Bill's point he just made, which I was just wondering if your advice is, if you get that revise and resubmit, maybe consider not actually doing that. Well, what is the intention then with a revise and resubmit, as opposed to just a flat rejection? Like, what is the journal in question maybe trying to get at in that scenario, if you're saying it's quite likely they're maybe not going to take that up if you do resubmit?
I think that the difficulty is if I, as the editor of the journal, and I guess I did this often enough, it comes back from the readers that they so-and-so should revise and submit. If the reader has given fairly specific comments and direction, well, okay, maybe. But when you revise and resubmit, I am likely to send it out to the same reader that I sent it out before. And so you'd best be careful that you paid attention to his or her comments. So I just think it's a little dicey. I think you really need to reflect whether you want to spend that time or whether you want to seek publication in another journal. We have certainly published essays that came back revised and submit, that's true. But it's also gone in the other direction where the reader thinks that the author has not revised sufficiently. And then we're left in, for me as an editor, left in a difficult situation because I've now taken up a good deal of your time, which you might have spent doing other things and submitting to other journals. So it's a little problematic.
That's interesting. That's helpful for me too, Bill. I think that there are cases in which I think readers are just on the fence and they don't want to come down one way or another. I mean, I think for you as an author, read the reports and see if you want to do what they ask. In other words, they have a vision. They have in mind there's something that could be really good here, and this is what it would take to do it, right? Like this is the revision it would need, or this is what this person would have to do to create this really good version of this that I'm imagining. And so take a really hard look at it, but then ask yourself, is that the really good version of it that you're imagining? I mean, if you're like, yes, that would actually, I think this is really taking me a direction that's really interesting, then you probably want to make those changes anyway, right? You maybe would want to incorporate those things in your next revision and try it again. So I think it's a little bit case specific in that way.
We have just a few minutes left, but I would love to have you respond to this question that Matt has raised in the chat about whether a graduate student should publish in journals.
I say shoot for the moon. I say play in the big leagues. It's not, I mean, I think go right for, I think you want to, I think that in this economy, you want to place you want to have a really good placement even right out of the gate, and that you can do it. I mean, we're here listening to these people who have like won this really prestigious award with their very first published works. And sometimes, I mean, the work you're doing when you're in graduate school, that is good career defining material. And there's no reason to think that you can't play on the same field as everyone else. That's what you're here to do.
I remember my graduate advisor, Jacqueline Hall, saying that you should always make the biggest argument you can make with your evidence, speak to the largest audience. And so I would agree, aim high. We are about at time. I want to add just one thought to the conversation about networking, which is also that, the fellowships that you seek to support your research are also outstanding opportunities to really get to know senior scholars. If you're at the American Antiquarian Society or MHS, there can be a lot of senior folks in the reading room with you. And I know that there is some urgency. I remember this from my days. I have a month in Boston. I have to work every hour that the library is open. But honestly, like sometimes the best advice is to go have lunch with the people and have those conversations, let spontaneity unfold. So I would also encourage people to pay attention when you're on fellowship to who else is around when you're in the reading room. Are there any final comments or questions as we wrap up this evening? Wow, well, I am so thrilled at the turnout tonight, which is excellent. I would invite people to throw in the chat before you log off what other topics you would like to see covered in a session like this. The Graduate Forum Committee is looking to support graduate students any way we can. So if there is a subject of another sort of evening conversation that would be of value to you, we'd love to hear about it. So feel free to throw that in the chat. I really want to thank Holly and Neal and Peter for sharing their expertise with us tonight. And I hope you all will be thinking about the quarterly and reading it with care. Anne Little, do you want to say a word or two about June?
Hi, yes, I'm the incoming chair of the program committee for the Graduate Forum at the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. And I just want to invite everybody who has a plausible early American topic. It does not have to be a colonial Massachusetts topic. It does not even have to be a colonial New England topic. To please apply and come and share your work with a distinguished group of fellow graduate students and other scholars in the area. We meet in late spring, and we're looking for a very diverse kind of set of projects. And I really encourage you to come because this is a critical way of building those networks that Holly and others have talked about tonight, about how to find other people who can give you good advice about where to send your work, about which journals might be appropriate for your work. So keep an eye out for the call for papers and for the call for submissions to that. That'll be coming up very soon.
Bob, would you like a closing word?
I just want to remind everyone about the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. The Colonial Society is part of that. Would be a great place to, if you want to do research in New England. And I want to thank Marla and Holly and Neal and Peter, as well as Bill Fowler for joining us and others for being part of this discussion. And thank you for the suggestions for other helpful discussions we can have at the Colonial Society. So thank you all.